Hi everyone, this is lecture 2 of week 12, and again I'm going to be going very fast, so you want to keep up with your readings. Indeed, the videos would make a lot more sense if you do the readings from the biblical text ahead of time. Also, I may or will ask questions from either Coogan or the biblical readings that I do not cover in the lectures, okay? In the preceding video, we talked about how North Israel or Samaria fell to the Assyrians in 722 BCE. And after this point, the biblical text, which was before kind of flipping back and forth from describing the situation in the south to describing the situation in the north and south and north, of course, this will stop, right? And instead, the text will focus on the only remaining country that's left, and that is the south, also simply known as Judah. Though the south will be composed of two tribes, the tribes of both Judah and Benjamin. Okay, so kind of the text will kind of center now on Judah. Okay. The fall of the north happens in the middle of an extremely important king in Judah or the south named Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, after Josiah and David, will probably be the most important king in Israelite history. And the way that you can tell he is that when you look at, for example, the Book of Chronicles, which I will not talk about at all in this class, which is dated quite late, maybe the 4th century retake on Israelite history, one of the main big king of Chronicles will be Hezekiah. Okay, and so Hezekiah's reign is important for several reasons. Okay, the first is because, as I just stated, the fall of the neighboring northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria, it happens during his reign, likely leading to increased scribal activity, which I discussed in the last video. Okay, indeed, some scholars, such as Coogan, takes this position. I do too. Believe actually that the first edition, sort of the original, I guess, of the Deuteronomistic history, right, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, was probably written, likely written during the reign of Hezekiah, actually. And that this earlier Hezekian version of the Deuteronomistic history, this was probably later used, picked up by scribes during the reign of Josiah, that is Hezekiah's grandson, to compose the Deuteronomistic history that we have now. Okay, we'll talk about Josiah in the very next video. Right. So that's the first reason, because of the scribal activity in the fall of the north. That's the first reason why Hezekiah is so important. The second reason that Hezekiah is so important is because the southern kingdom, like the northern kingdom, during his reign, will come very, very, very close to nearly being destroyed by the Assyrians. Okay. However, miraculously, the southern kingdom under Hezekiah, unlike the north, for whatever reason, we'll get to that in a minute, survives, okay? And the survival of Judah from the Assyrians, the Assyrian attack and this happens in 701 BCE, it will be remembered as a miraculous event that proved or showed the truthfulness of Zion theology and the Davidic promise. So this becomes a big event, okay? Lastly, the reason why Hezekiah is so very important is because we have we scholars have a lot of evidence from the time period of his reign. We have a lot of textual evidence in the Bible. For example, we have 3 different accounts of Hezekiah in 3 different books of the Bible: Kings, Isaiah, and 2nd Chronicles. We'll all talk about Hezekiah. We will, and of course, this this amount of text really speaks to how important a figure this king was, right? Also probably hints of the increased scribal activity that was happening during the period of his reign. Okay, alongside the kind of textual evidence from the biblical text, we also have a ton of rich archaeological and epigraphic data and material from the time of Hezekiah. And you can actually see some of this if you go to the museum in London. Okay, what is that? The Oxford, the British Museum in London have this great evidence. Okay, this includes the evidence that we have from the time of Hezekiah, includes the Assyrian annals, these jars that are stamped with lamellic, these whatever. Okay, there's these little jars that are very, very important. You also get included in this is this famous tunnel that Hezekiah constructed to bring water into the city, which you can actually visit and go through, called Hezekiah's Tunnel in Jerusalem. If you go to Jerusalem, you can walk through this tunnel and you come out the other side. Anyways, and it has a little plaque, that dates it to the time of Hezekiah, which is unbelievable because you never find archaeological stuff that tells you when it was actually constructed. Or in short, with Hezekiah, unlike with a lot of biblical characters, we just have lots of stuff, lots of text, lots of evidence, lots of everything that you can compare to the text. Okay. Um, for the sake of time, I am going to, however, focus on one story that we have on Hezekiah, really the main event of his reign, which is the attack by the Assyrians in 701. Okay. Just like with the north, we are told that shortly after the north falls, the Assyrians now turn to invade and conquer the south, or Judah as well. And we are told in 2 Kings 18 and 19 that King Sennacherib of Assyria sent his army to put the city of Jerusalem under siege. And what we know is that, through other sources, that, that he's kind of conquering all the little towns along the way to Jerusalem. Okay. And at this point, siege warfare ensues, and siege warfare was really awful, right? I mean, it's really terrible. Basically, an army stood outside your gates or walls of the city and trying to ram the walls in while the people stayed and died a lot of times. This ended up with the people inside the city starving to death or dying of thirst. And a lot of people think that Hezekiah's tunnel was in part to get ready for this attack, to make sure that there was water that was coming into the city while they were put under siege. Okay, so it was really awful. Okay, and this explains perhaps the awfulness of siege warfare might explain what happens when Assyria attacks Jerusalem. And I'm going to read from 2 Kings 18, verse 13 and following. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. And King Hezekiah of Judah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong, withdraw from me, whatever you impose on me, I will bear. The king of Assyria demanded King Hezekiah of Judah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, and Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasury of the king's house. And at that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord's house and from the doorposts that King Hezekiah of Judah had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. Okay, so this is not good, but kind of looks like the end of the story, right? Sort of boring, very short story. Assyria attacks. Okay, Hezekiah decides to pay them off. Why? How? By stripping the temple and the palace of all the kind of gold and silver that's found there. At which point, right? I mean, you can kind of tell where the ending should go. The Assyrians go away, right? And they leave, and that ends the kind of attack, right? And maybe in an earlier version of the story that we don't have, this is indeed what happens, okay? But instead, what you get in the biblical text at this point is a sudden turn, okay? Instead of the story ending with Hezekiah paying the Assyrian king off, okay? Instead, the story kind of continues on, almost becoming like the never-ending story, okay? Right after being told how Hezekiah stripped the temple, we are told that instead of withdrawing, the Assyrian king does this instead. And this is in verse 17. Okay, 2 Kings 18. Okay, the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rapsaris, and the Rapshakai with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. So we are told, oddly, in verse 17, all of a sudden there's this turn. The Assyrian king, instead of withdrawing, instead attacks. Okay, and sends several messengers, though it will be this main guy called the Rapshakai who will do most of the talking, right? To surround the city, to attack, and to kind of say threatening messages, trying to, in an attempt to try to force the city to surrender. Okay, and at this point, the story really turns to the Rapshakai, okay, who we are told are now standing in front of the walls of the city and start shouting really terrifying threats at the people inside the wall, trying to get them to surrender. And what he basically says is that, no one is going to save them from Assyria. He says that the Egyptians are not going to save, the Israelites, that their pious king, Hezekiah, well, he can't save them, right? That their own armies, which is like puny, right? That, they can't save them. And he says that even their God cannot save the Judeans. Okay, well, why not? Well, because the Assyrian army, the Rapshakai explains, God will not save them because the Assyrian army was sent by God himself. Why did God send a foreign army against his own people? Well, the Rapshakai explains further, it's because God is super angry, not happy with Hezekiah's actions. Okay, what actions, right? Well, apparently, And again, you can only get this through kind of what you see in the text, kind of almost reading between the small hints, right? Is that apparently Hezekiah has reformed or centralized the cult before this attack. That is, he shut down all the kind of local shrines and sort of shrines on the outlying areas and centralized worship to only the temple in Jerusalem, okay? And this should ring off some bells because it sounds a lot like what what the book of Deuteronomy tells you to do, okay? And it very much sounds like something from affiliated with another king named Josiah. Okay, I'll get to that in the next video. Okay, in short, okay, these cultic actions are reinterpreted by the Rabshakeh as something that offends God, not something that pleases God. And of course, he's wrong, right? Because, these are actions that are precisely prescribed by Deuteronomy as actions that God demands, okay? And in short, the Rabshakeh says that nothing, not even Israel's God, can save the Israelites, and therefore he tells them, just give up. Just surrender. It will be no big deal. We'll just relocate you, just like we did with your northern, counterparts, to a nice other land. Okay, it'll be fine. Okay. So considering that the people of Judah just saw what happened to their sister country in the north, they all realize that the Assyrians are not fooling around, that that they are probably up next to be exiled and destroyed. So we are told that when the king of Judah, Hezekiah hears of this, okay, on all the threats that the Rabshakeh is making, that he goes to the temple and prays, at which point the prophet Isaiah shows up. Yes, that Isaiah, the one with the big book, okay? Which we don't have time to go into. Very complicated book, okay? Like the favorite prophet of the church, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he shows up and says, don't worry about it. So, and in essence, what he tells Hezekiah is that the Lord has told him, Isaiah, that the Assyrians are going to, this threat will disappear, okay? They're going to leave because of some weird rumor, okay? And that this will be the end of this whole threatening to be destroyed business, okay? And lo and behold, in the next couple of verses, right, at 2 Kings 19, chapter 19, verses 8 and 9, this seems to be what happens, right? Some kind of rumor, we are told, is kind of heard. The Syrians appear to be getting ready to leave. It seems, again, like we're, nearing the end point of the story. And yet, again, right as the text is about to end, you get again a sudden turnaround, right? The text turns again and says, no, just kidding. And the Rabshakeh at 2 Kings 19, verse 9, comes back to deliver a second message, okay? I'll talk about what all this complication may mean, okay? And so he comes back now with the second message. The second message is kind of like more of the first message, except even more offensive and blasphemous, okay? In this second message of the Rabshakeh, the emissary pretty much calls Yahweh a big weakling who is no different from any other gods of the countries that were conquered by Assyria. And this upping of the blasphemy, it seems to be like a way of adding drama to the story, right? What it also does is kind of dares God to show up and really punch the Assyrians in the face and give, the hearers and readers of the story a much bigger, more climactic finish, right? Which is exactly what happens. Okay? And this is 2 Kings 19, verse 35 and following. That very night, the angel of the Lord set out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When morning dawned, they were all dead bodies. And then King Sennacherib of Assyria left. He went home and lived at Nineveh. As he was worshiping in the house of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer killed him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. And his son Esarhaddon succeeded him. Okay. Finally, with this finale, the story comes to an end. Okay. And almost a kind of replay, I think, of the Passover. We are told that God has finally had enough, pushed to his limits by the blasphemous words of the Rabshakeh. God sends a slaughtering angel to kill the Assyrians while they're in their camps. Okay, and not done yet, God then goes after the king who caused this whole problem in the first place, the king of Assyria, causing him to be murdered on his home turf by his very own sons. Okay, revenge, it seems, is completed. Okay, if only life worked out as neatly and fairly as what happens in the Bible. Okay, and of course, that's the point. Life doesn't usually work out so neatly. Okay, and really, you can see in the text these kind of conflicting accounts, motivations, whatever, where what you want to have happen and what might have really happened butt up against each other. Okay, with this very quick summary that I've just given you, what this shows, right? It should be evident to you hearing it how layered, how reworked, how retouched up the story of Jerusalem's survival during the 701 Assyrian attack is. Okay, this story seems to be not just one story, but like three stories all squished together or layered on top of one another. Okay, all having to do with how these Assyrians, they came to attack Jerusalem in 701, but did not succeed in conquering it. Okay, most scholars think that the reason we have this complicated, squished, or layered three stories in one in 2 Kings 18:19, the reason for it is that the survival of Judah in 701 from this attack, considering that it happened so soon after the north was destroyed by Assyria, it was a big, big deal. Okay, why? Because, like I said, it reaffirmed that Zion theology and the Davidic promise that it was true. Okay, and because of this reason, because it was such a significant event theologically, that this story as a result grew bigger and bigger, more and more miraculous in the retelling and in the memory. Okay, until finally it becomes literally a miracle story with God sending a divine angel to kill Israel's enemy himself. Okay, almost like what happened with the crossing of the Reed or the Red Sea, right? Remember how I said that also was probably, originally happened somewhat differently, and it grew in the storyteller's imagination until it became truly a miraculous event. Okay, so then, going to history instead of what the story wants you to believe, right? How did Judah survive while the north didn't when the Assyrians attacked? Okay, well, interestingly, scholars don't really know. They debate this. Okay, we do have Assyrian accounts of this event, but interestingly enough, they kind of gloss over why they were not successful in completely taking over and destroying Jerusalem. Okay, obviously the Assyrian writers are going to be like super into describing why they attacked a tiny nation and were unable at the end to conquer it. Okay, so scholars don't know. Okay, we just know that for some reason Judah does not fall to the Assyrians in the 8th century, and that this, in retrospect, becomes really almost another high point of Israelite history. A point where God barged in and again miraculously saved the Israelite nation. Okay, and this event was actually kind of miraculous, especially in hindsight. Okay, had Judah been destroyed at this point, the same thing that happened to the 10 tribes of the north almost assuredly would have happened to the 2 remaining tribes of Judah. Okay, they would have been forcibly relocated and their culture likely decimated, right, lost, right? And we probably therefore would not have the Hebrew Bible. Okay, who knows if we would even have the Jewish people as we know them today. Okay, indeed, out of all the ancient peoples and writings mentioned in the biblical text, the Jewish people, the descendants of the Israelites or Israel, and their writings, I mean, this is one of the very few that have survived. Okay, yes, of course, we have writings from the ancient Near East, from other people like the Egyptians and the Assyrians, so we do have a lot of tablets, but notice that Israel is a teeny, 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 tiny little country. Okay, and the survival of this group, a group of people from this tiny country whose identity remains interestingly intact, and the survival of the literature from this tiny country, I mean, this is pretty miraculous, almost unbelievable. Okay, and this unbelievable kind of survival probably would not have happened had not another unbelievable event happened earlier, when in 701 Judah, for some mysterious reason, survives the Assyrian attack.